Hello again, and welcome to the last of Bethlem Museum of the Mind's book club videos on Fiona Tan's book entitled 10 Madnesses. I hope you have enjoyed the book and the introduction it has given to Theodore Géricault's 5 surviving portraits of monomania. And I trust the comparisons we have been drawing with the portraits of Bethlem patients commissioned by Alexander Morrison have also been illuminating. You may remember the explanation that Tan gives of her interest in these paintings back on page 17 of the book. As a working artist, her idea was to generate new artworks, not oil on canvas but film studies, in a bid to fill the gap left by Gericault's 5 missing monomania portraits to join the ones that do exist: monomania of envy, exaltation, addictions to gambling and theft, and so on. The first obstacle she encountered in doing so was, as I mentioned 3 weeks ago, that details of the 5 missing artworks are nowhere to be found. And anyway, there never was an agreed static list of just 10 monomanias. The field of diagnostics was ever-changing. In 1826, Alexander Morrison listed just 6 monomanias, but by 1843 he listed over a dozen. Tan overcame these difficulties by giving up the ambition to discover what the missing portraits represented in favour of simply choosing descriptors that would have been in use at the time. On page 84 of 10 Madnesses, she tells us that her proposal is to make 3 portraits of women suffering respectively from megalomania, religious mania, and either erotomania and pyromania, she hasn't decided yet, and 2 portraits of men, one suffering homicidal mania and the other with a personality disorder involving compulsive hoarding. Several of these descriptors map over to Morrison's 1843 classificatory exercise, which includes first, several varieties of religious monomania, second, 2 varieties of amatory insanity, erotomania, in which the sentiment predominates, Morrison tells us, and nymphomania, in which the animal propensity is more conspicuous, according to him. And third, monomanias with propensities variously to burn, to steal, to drunkenness, and to violence. In the 19th century, megalomania would have more been likely described as monomania with exalted ideas, along the lines of Elizabeth Carroll, we spoke about last week, and the man with delusions of military grandeur. Personality disorder is not a 19th century concept, but monomania with a propensity to hoard might well have been. It'll be fascinating to see in due course the end results of Fiona Tan's endeavours, but in the meantime, the reason why I'm here in Bethlem Museum of the Mind's exhibition space is as a reminder that Theodore Géricault wasn't the first, and Fiona Tan won't be the last, to use their artistic talents to represent mental distress. I started this series of videos by introducing you to the statues of so-called raving and melancholy madness, dating from 1676. And today I'm bringing the series to a close in the company of the famous painting Crazy Jane by Richard Dadd. We know it's famous because, apart from anything else, because a couple of years ago a live streamed discussion about the work featuring the artist Cornelia Parker attracted the largest online audience the museum has ever had. It's easy to access this discussion on our YouTube channel if you look for it. Dadd himself is famous as one of the best known Bethlem patients in history. His doctor was none other than Alexander Morrison, who might well have diagnosed him with monomania with propensity to homicide. Dadd's own extraordinary story is told elsewhere, but there's a story behind Crazy Jane herself. In the early 19th century, Crazy Jane was the fictional archetype of female insanity triggered by disappointment in love, or in fact, betrayal in love. And she was the subject of a haunting ballad of the same name, which tells the story of her suitor dealing falsely with her and her losing her wits as a consequence. I will never forget the evocative rendition of this ballad given here at the museum a few years ago by the singer Vivian Alice. It was achingly tender, wounded, angry and sorrowful by turns. Well, the portrait alongside me here is Richard Dadd's own tribute to this archetype. The subject raises her hands heavenwards as if in mute protest or perhaps entreaty. Her hair flows wildly, as does the hair of mad women throughout the history of art. Because she's a fictional character, it's relatively easy for us to remember that she is an archetype, a product of a cultural imagination informed by shared assumptions about the sphere of female interests and the limits of female resilience. Nevertheless, the Crazy Jane archetype had a real-world impact if the number of female patients admitted to Bethlem Hospital in the 19th century as a result of disappointment in love is anything to go by. And to judge by the number of men admitted to Bethlem in the same period as a result of losses in business, there were parallel male archetypes with real-world implications. Notwithstanding the fact that the subjects chosen by Theodore Géricault and Alexander Morrison were not fictional, the parameters within which they were made in the past and within which they are seen in the present are also constructed by archetypes. Archetypes concerning the representation of men and women and of the sane and insane. That was the point I was trying to make last week by introducing you to the portrait of Elizabeth Carroll as if she was Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother. Very often what we see is conditioned by what we are told. And what we are told is not always as well founded as we might think. The statues of raving and melancholy madness I stood next to at the start of this series of videos are a case in point. You may remember their names are not original, and the diagnosis of melancholy is contested. It's the subject of dispute. As you all know, if you have read pages 82 and 83 of 10 Madnesses, it turns out that every last one of Gericault's portraits form another case in point. There is little or no evidence that any of the surviving paintings were titled prior to being sold in 1863, 41 years after their creation, and 39 years after the death of the artist. It's perfectly possible, therefore, as Fiona Tan says, that the titles given to each of the 5 portraits, each specific monomania, were devised as part of a sales pitch in order to entice a potential buyer. This revelation at the end of Tan's book is one that has been worth waiting for because it cracks open the whole issue of the representation of mental ill health. Do you remember this portrait that hangs in the Museum of Fine Art in Ghent? I must confess that once I'd been told that it was of a kleptomaniac, I think I subconsciously began to view the subject in a slightly less trusting way. Maybe to look for clues that he was a bit shifty. The critic John Berger, whom Tan cites at the beginning and end of her book, had the perception and instinct to ignore that label and titled the essay he wrote about this portrait, "The Man with Tousled Hair." To be able to do this is a great gift to which we should all aspire. Well, we've come to the end of our book club now, and I thank you for watching this video and your other online engagements with us. Here at Bethlem Museum of the Mind, we'd like to know what you have made of this experience. So to capture feedback, we have devised a simple online survey, and you'll find links to this survey in the comments below this video on YouTube and on Facebook. And as a thank you to everyone who submits their name and address, their postal address with their answers, we'll send out one of these postcards of the man with tousled hair as a keepsake. Goodbye for now.